Good afternoon, all. My name is Nellie Scott, and I'm the director of the Carita Art Center and the estate for Carita Kent. I'm really excited and honored to be invited to moderate today's discussion in celebration of Teresa Baker's exhibition, Pulling Up the Prairie, which is currently on view at the DeBoer Gallery in Los Angeles. Pulling Up the Prairie presents so beautifully the large-scale works created by Teresa, and the title of the exhibition is a play on Ophelia Zepida's poem, Pulling Down the Clouds. And this larger idea of trying to grasp something so vast, something so ephemeral, and take it with you, which the show and the works highlighted in it do so wonderfully. I wanted to give a little bit more about Teresa. Teresa Baker is an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes in Western North Dakota. She's had recent solo exhibitions at Interface Gallery and Gray Contemporary. She has exhibited widely in the San Francisco Bay Area at venues such as Yerba Buena Center for the Arts. In 2016, she had her first solo museum show at the Art Museum of Southeast Texas in Beaumont. She was the 2020 Native American Fellow for Visual Arts at the UCross Foundation, the Turnesol Award Artist in Residence at the Headland Center for the Arts, and the Artist in Residence at the MacDowell Colony. She received her MFA from California College of the Arts and her BA from Fordham University. She currently lives and works in Los Angeles, California. She will be joined in conversation today by Dr. Scott Manning Stevens. Dr. Scott Manning Stevens is a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and holds a Ph.D. and master's degree from Harvard University. A highly sought after educator, Stevens has taught at a number of universities, including Harvard, Arizona State, and SUNY Buffalo. He is an associate professor and director of Native American and Indigenous Studies at Syracuse University. He has held several fellowships at major archives, including the John Carter Brown and the Newberry libraries. Stevens has lectured broadly throughout the United States and internationally. He is currently a Fulbright Research Fellow in Hungary. He's an avid researcher, and Dr. Stevens' primary areas of interest include diplomatic and cultural strategies of resistance among North American Indians in the face of European and American settler colonialism, as well as the political and aesthetic issues that surround museums and the indigenous cultures they put on display. He has published broadly on Native American art and settler depictions of indigenous peoples. Next year, Stevens will be a fellow at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Research, where he will finish a book-length research project titled Indian Collectibles, Appropriations and Resistance in the Haudenosaunee Homelands. We're really thrilled to have both of them here today, and I'd love to just go ahead and hand over the conversation to Teresa and Dr. Scott.
Thank you, Nellie, so much. And I'm very excited to talk with both of you, and thank you to everyone who has joined in the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, as well. Thanks for inviting me and letting me have this opportunity to meet both Teresa and Nellie. It's wonderful to do so. So I guess I'll just jump right in with some of the questions I think come to mind when I look at your art, and maybe some other people might have similar questions, and partly spurred by the title of the exhibit, and just also the sense of these shapes, these abstractions, these colors, etc. And so when I think of your work, I think about the concept of place in your work, and but not only just place, but space and place as 2 different ways of thinking. And so, by space, I mean an abstract, almost cartographic notion of the pieces, the way that land is represented as space on a map, and you realize that it's so often arbitrarily bounded, and the shapes have nothing to do with the lived experience of the land. And so when I think of the plains or the prairie, and then I think of the experience of, say, flying over them in an airplane, and you see that weird patchwork on the ground. And so I think that there's that sense of the kind of the abstractness of space when it's not a lived experience, but it's a controlled, legislated experience. Those are state lines. Those are the borders of a reservation or allotments. All those shapes come to mind as these abstractions of space. And then when I turn to the notion of place as an embodied notion of the space you experience, you live in, you call home, you travel on the surface of the ground, then I think of it, in much different terms, whether it is not just the shapes of things, but now the textures, and you have these wonderful textures and gestures at textures, which I like about it too, because some of the surfaces remind me of things like buffalo hides or a stretch of prairie bisected by a highway, things like this. But it's all simulacra, right? It's all artifice and thereby intentional, intervened upon, not happenstance, not found. And so I'm curious then about your notion of space when you set to work, space and place, that are these some of the guiding principles, given that you come from a very, in my mind, since I'm familiar with the Dakotas and that region, a very marked landscape, that both historically lived upon and so on, and very unique for someone coming from the East. It really strikes me whenever I'm there. So I'm interested in how these works are in conversation with those concepts, I guess.
Well, I must say you are spot on, Scott. I mean, everything you talked about is so much of what I'm exploring in the work. And so it's really nice to hear that that's coming through and that you received that from the work. To give a little background, I'm trying to capture space and place completely. And I grew up in the National Park Service system. My father worked for the National Park Service. So much of our life was spent in my early years outside. And our trips were, to historical sites or camping or, it was just, I feel like when I think back to my childhood, it was outside all the time. And we did a lot of driving as well, because we moved quite a bit. So we were always in the car or visiting family and so that kind of like perception of like looking through the window and just looking at space, just constant space and expanse. And that really shaped how I see, and it really, shaped that kind of aesthetic formation. So, and I think that I'm trying to capture that in the work. It's my version of doing landscape, and trying to capture the feeling rather than a representation necessarily, but like what you're talking about, like a highway intersecting, the plains or something. Those are the details I stared at all the time. It was like, you see this, just all of these forms sitting on this landscape, and it's really minimal. The plains are so minimal, so these forms become so important. A grain bin becomes like such an important form that you just kind of stare at. And yeah, so I'm definitely trying to kind of capture all of that. And as far as the lived experience or well, first I want to talk about boundaries as well. I think that I have such a hard time with squares and rectangles, like in a sort of more traditional painting style, because it is such a strict boundary. And with landscape, you don't have that. You have the organic, shapes, and apart from whatever we're outlining as property, landscape just keeps extending. And so the thing that these materials, especially AstroTurf, offers me, or materials I'm searching for, I want them to allow a boundary that I can shape, and a boundary that feels like it can keep expanding rather than confining into the shape. So, and then I think as far as the lived experience, it is, you know, those, I touched on this a little bit, but those details of like being in the landscape, observing, and you know, they are reminiscent of hides, of that tradition of painting on hides, that being a storytelling platform. But I like that. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, just imagine with your father being in the Park Service and really a kind of public historian figure, that he must have told you everything about the territory you were passing through. That it wasn't like just an empty landscape, like here's where this happened. Like it becomes storied in a way that for a lot of people it wouldn't be, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely. Lots of understanding about where we were, and lots of storytelling, and you know, our childhood thankfully was filled with history in that way. So yeah.
I'm curious, just because I've had friends from either the Southwest, native friends from the Southwest, or the prairies, and when they come back east, sometimes I remember in college, you know, this bucolic setting in New Hampshire, asking one of my Navajo friends how he liked it, and he said, oh, it's just too many trees. You know, like he couldn't see the sky, he felt suffocated. He said, why is everything green? It doesn't need to be green. And I wondered, since I see that you know, you went to school both in the New York City area, in the Bronx, and then in San Francisco, what were those culture shocks? Did they resonate eventually in your work, or I'm just curious.
I think honestly, they pushed me to really appreciate where I came from even more, you know, and it just kept coming out in my art. It was something that all of a sudden I wanted to explore. So it was like being away from it allowed me to connect to it.
Right.
You know, the East Coast was great when I was in my 20s, and going to school in New York City was incredible experience, and good educational experience. But I do find that it is a little suffocating now, like just there are a lot of trees. I've learned that I've like kind of reverted back. When I was younger, you know, I couldn't wait to get out. You know, I was like, oh, there's just nothing here. It's just like prairie. You know, what do you look at? But now I see that there's actually so much. You know, there's so much detail and so much richness, historically, but also, you know, just yeah, everything is a lot.
Yeah, I think the first time I went out to that landscape of yours, I felt kind of agoraphobic, right? I was just like, there is way too much sky here. And I had that feeling that it suddenly was actually possible to fall off the planet somehow. And so I guess to each their comfort zone is where they grew up. One of the other, I'm also thinking then more about Plains native, you know, aesthetic traditions and some of the aspects of that, if they are in your work, or how they touch. I'm looking right now at Good Weather there on the screen, and when I first saw that, I thought, well, the material is reminiscent of an animal hide, not necessarily a buffalo hide, but to me it looked like a deer skin, an untanned one. But that diagonal line there reminded me of when I looked at some of these really gorgeous buffalo robes that are stitched together. And rather than obscure the suture, they make it into a real thing of beauty on its own, even though it's really simple, right? That the line is kept straight. It's very delicately geometric, a pattern of either quill work or bead. And glue, which I love as part of the traditional buffalo, because I was looking at, you use glue and solder and things like that. And I thought, all part of a tradition in a certain way. So I'm wondering, are those things are you gesturing at that, or is that me looking for something? Or
No, I'm absolutely gesturing at that. I think there's so much life in those details. I use a lot of sinew as well to go back in and sew materials down. And so like letting the sinew show itself, letting the material show itself, that process, I feel like that's where the artist comes in, the kind of evidence of the person who made it comes in. And I think that those details offer just so much life to the piece. And so in a way, I really want to highlight those details. Yeah.
Yeah, and they really work for me in the same way they work in those buffalo robes, is that they put a human hand in it, and that you realize the work and the thinking and the precision, that it's, as I said, because they're artifices, they are intentional. And that's the power behind it, to me, of the creativity behind it, that yes, they're, minimalist, and they have that echoes of the minimalism of the landscape, but then they have that real delicacy. If we could go through, I'm sorry for forgetting the name, the blue, it's mostly a blue.
Edges and waves. Yeah.
Yeah. Just, I mean, besides stunningly beautiful in the color, like you find in, some plains art that just pops, like whether it be a shield or a teepee design, there's all of a sudden an intense burst of color that you're not used to, that you're not associating with it. But I also see those kind of abstracted notions of where X's become stars, and, boundaries that move, undulate, become rivers, and so on. And I find it moving for that reason, because of its ability, even at such a level of abstraction, to connect with this very long aesthetic process, which had its own wonderful engagement with abstraction. That's, part of what I love about, especially women's geometric plains art, those box and border, buffalo robes, or the parfleches, that they're so abstract, that they make modernism seem kind of old-fashioned when you get to it. So I'm just interested in your kind of sense of tradition. Do you feel any compulsion towards it, or is it something that you just naturally think of, that's part of my aesthetic? I'm curious about that.
Well, the other thing I was going to mention was a lot of the like the wedding hides, a lot of those are really minimal. I mean, like if you look at, that's like minimalism, they're amazing. But I love when materials can stand in for something else. So like the yarn that's sitting on top of this piece here, it reminds me of quill work. There's something about the challenge, or something that engages me in the same way that the astroturf could almost, function as a hide potentially, like it's representing something else. And that doesn't mean that, maybe the actual quills or beading might not come into my work in the future, but it's, I don't know what it is, but it's just like, I love heightening a material. I love taking these basic materials and that challenge of making them something else. And so I do think that they are stand-ins for in that way. Yeah.
I love their power to evoke within a minimalist aesthetic, because they themselves may be very simple, the intervention, but given the minimalism, it becomes almost Baroque, right? You're like, wow, she's really going out of her realm there. And I love that about them. I mean, maybe that's my own perversity of the sight, but I did feel like when you encountered certain shapes and that, they seemed to pop out and take you in a different direction than you thought maybe the piece wanted originally.
Yes. And I do have such a process-based practice that it is about, I mean, this work goes through so many iterations. And it's kind of this figuring out what the work wants to be, and this shape taking over, and then the relationships between the shapes on the piece. How are they interacting? What is their, in a sense, their language with each other, to then create this autonomous piece artwork. So
Well, that leads right into one of my other questions, which is about process. And I wondered, because there is also a sculptural element about them, even though they're planic, is there a drying phase and then a testing materials? Like, is it, it's not like you just sit down with a carpet cutter and, finish. So I'm just curious about the process that goes into it.
yeah, I think that the process is it's years. It's like these continual building blocks. It's going through the material beforehand. So I worked on felt for quite a while, and then I needed some transparency. It was kind of getting too thick, and so I started looking at plastics, which led me to AstroTurf. And so I do have a drawing practice, but I rarely show my drawings. They're for really no reason, but they're a way for me to express these shapes and like get this kind of this form out really quickly, and have it not be so precious, which I think is really important, because once there's preciousness, I feel like we lose, or I lose a little bit of that life that I really want my work to imbue. And but then all of that comes into the work, just not directly, so it's like slowly figuring out what these materials can do, what sort of qualities they're already giving me. For example, AstroTurf can hold its own shape. I don't need to make a backing for it like I would with canvas. So what is it giving me, and then how far can I push it? Yeah. And then I've just started adding on, more natural materials. And I think part of it is like a shift in, I would say, yeah, like for mapping out the land. I have a garden in the backyard here in Los Angeles, a Hidatsa garden. And so for the past few years, I started growing this because I keep continuing to choose to live in urban environments. So I've been thinking a lot about going forward, what are the traditional things I can do to, stay connected, and gardening was very important for my tribe. And so I have heirloom seeds that I've started planting, and it's become a really important thing for me to do every summer. But then my studio is outside, part of it anyway. So I have this one wall here, and so I kind of get to work alongside the garden, and it's really kind of influenced bringing in natural materials to the work, and it becomes a way of form, because I still am using formal investigations, but then beyond that, it becomes this personal, history and connection to also bring into the work through material.
I love that, because it's also refined and specific to who your people are. And I feel like with Mandan Hadassah people, that they get lumped together with all the horse nations, and no one thinks that they were great agriculturalists, and that they had these fields and fields, and that they had sedentary villages where they were for millennia. And so the sense that because of where you're from, you're going to be related to horses and teepees, and that all good things, but not specific to your, to your people's name. You had horses, sure, who didn't, but so I love that the garden is the thing to bring with you, right? And that is in its own way portable, and is medicine to your culture, and to my own as well. And so that I really love that detail. Thanks for sharing
Yeah.
I am always curious, you know, it's like a studio visit. Like, I do want to see where the stuff is made, as it were, and because it gives you a sense of their process and the way they draw these things together. And especially because, you know, one of the things that might surprise some people is just when they see like AstroTurf, what could seem more artificial and more fake and you know that there has to be a reason. It's obviously it's a material you like working with because it's evocative, but um, it challenges, I think, people's, you know, prejudices about what Indigenous art's going to be made of and what it's trying to use and so on. So I'm fascinated by those choices too.
Absolutely. And I think there's something in AstroTurf as a material that allows for that openness. You know, it allows, whereas if I was using hide, and it doesn't mean I may not in the future, but it comes with such a loaded already history to it, which is beautiful. But I find what I want to achieve with abstraction, that in some way using these kind of overlooked or common materials almost allows me to get there more so than if I was using some of these other concrete materials. So
Right, and it allows for these, you know, I think really suggestive juxtapositions of things like the corn husk on the astroturf, right?
yeah, yeah,
When they come together, then you're forced to think about those two worlds of the traditional, the contemporary, the modern, the urban, you know, so
absolutely.
really exciting to me, these gestures. So
Thank you.
finally, I'd like to ask you a bit. I know you were very recently at UCross, as was mentioned, and so Wyoming, not quite the same landscape as you're from, and yet up in the, you know, I think in people's minds, they're all just up there together somewhere. But could you tell us a little bit about your experiences there and how that, even in the time you were there, may have left an impression with you about land and work and place?
Yeah, you know, honestly, it was the first time that I was making art, not that it's where I'm from, but in a landscape that was really close to where I'm from, because I keep making, you know, art in New York and LA, or all, you know, these different cities I've been living in. And so I was really curious about how that might influence this, because I keep talking about these spaces. And I think it really allowed a freedom, you know, the space there reminded me, um, it reminded me of my decision making to stay open and to I don't know, I haven't figured out how to completely articulate it, but it was a really good experience that I think I'm still kind of going back to, and still like thinking about this space that, you know, I don't get here. So
Yeah, I think that is one of the wonderful aspects of engaging with a space like that, or any really open kind of new space, that your mind will keep going back to it and processing it and rethinking it, and what you may make in response to it a month from now is going to be different 2 years from now.
absolutely. Yeah. I think that's the beautiful thing about going to a residency program like UCross. So is you're allowed that freedom.
Right.
Yeah.
I was interested in this piece, Fishing Basket. Could you tell us a little bit about, because it seems so different than the other type of work you're doing?
Yes. Oh, and I know you brought up sculptural elements, and I don't, and my work borders, you know, it borders between, yeah, 2D and 3D. And I like that it lives in that space, you know, but I started making baskets in the last few years, kind of along with the gardening practice, actually. Because we made burden baskets, you know, the women did, for the garden, you know, to haul produce and everything. We also used willow in our earth lodges, which is what, you know, our dwellings. So I like this long history with this material. And so I wanted to create a traditional burden basket, but of course, once I started, I was like, oh, well, let's see where this material can take me, and let me make it non-functional, and instead focus on the form, and these like lines that are just left, I think are just, I love that. I love leaving them open and then adding in, I wanted to like really reference the materials I was also using with the yarn and the AstroTurf. So, so I have continued making baskets, and I think that they have a good relationship with the wall pieces. I'm not weaving, I don't have a textile background. Instead, I think of my marks as like almost like a painting mark. It's like sitting on top of the AstroTurf, sitting on top of the plane. Oh yeah, this was from UCross actually.
Oh, beautiful.
So start of a basket, and it was just so nice to be able to take it outside. And actually, Jacob, if you want to just go to the movie clip, if that's possible. Usually I'm soaking my willows in my bathroom, in my bathtub here in Los Angeles, which is right there. But I got to at least soak them at UCross in the creek by the studios, which was a really nice thing to do every day.
Oh, yeah.
There's some of that UCross landscape.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that the willows are another thing, like you mentioned, that I can take with me and are something that I can continue exploring, and kind of going back and forth between the wall pieces and the floor pieces. So
Wonderful. Yeah, because it also moves you out into that space a little more too. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's well, I'm always rolling up AstroTurf, so yeah.
I had the wonderful opportunity, not to like stop such a wonderful conversation, because I feel like it's just so flowing. Wonderful conversation with Teresa, and I kind of wanted to maybe see if we could pull on the thread of a little bit further about how you landed with AstroTurf too, and your kind of first experience with the materiality of working with that. And so it kind of, what we had talked a little bit prior around this kind of romanticism around pieces as well.
Well, it's funny because I've never assigned that word to my work, Nellie, until our conversation the other day. And I was like, yes, it is. I mean, I love romantic landscapes, that kind of like 19th century. It's so, it's so big, these beautiful landscape paintings. But truthfully, I feel like the work has an element of romanticism in terms of, I had this great experience, growing up, and how I view land, both culturally, both through, also just living in the National Park Service. And I think I want the work to carry that, I want everyone to experience that on some level. And so that kind of feeling of what landscape gives us is really something I want to come through. And I think that is maybe the romantic element of it, for sure. So, but yeah, I mentioned that, my process goes through a few different materials, which just keep leading me on to the next thing I start investigating. So I was living in Beaumont, Texas at the time. I lived there for about 3 years. And my husband is from there, and we were taking care of his grandparents. But so anyway, I was working with felt, started using plastic. Plastic to me just doesn't have much of a feeling in it. It's just kind of, it just didn't work. And so I was heading to Home Depot, like on a search for some new material. And I just saw this bright blue astroturf and I was like, wow, this is amazing. Because I didn't grow up even thinking about astroturf. I feel like the kind of like northern states, you don't find it a lot like you do in Southern California or even the South. And so it just kind of, that's what opened me up to that whole world. Yeah.
Well, thank you for explaining that. I just thought it was so wonderful to hear more about that. And I was curious if maybe perhaps we could open it up if anybody else has any questions for either of you as we wind down. If people want to drop them in the chat, if you have a question for either Teresa or Dr. Scott Stevens.
I just wanted to bring up one quick thing. Scott, I know you had mentioned to me prior asking kind of about my experience through school, undergrad and grad school, about the role of Indigenous art and art history. And I wanted to touch on that a little bit because I've been thinking about it and just how much in my experience, although it was great education, but there was no talk of Indigenous art in art history, in our books, in our classes. And it's kind of crazy to me as I think about that, how little we talked to, like abstract expressionists were so influenced by, Indigenous art and just but also why are these artists not in the history books? But, that's a bigger,
Or the museums.
yeah, or museums and so.
Yeah, I've been in several institutions where in art history, they'll have, these really fine-tuned courses on the early Baroque, the late Baroque, the High Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance. And then you'll have one blanket course called the Art of the Americas, Oceania, and Africa. And I'm like, hey, why not just lump them all together? No time period, just, and I'm just, really, is this what we're doing still? That's why I wondered if you even had that type of experience, because we're trying to introduce it right now, but this is 2021, at Syracuse, to teach some Native artist and include, when we teach the art of the American West, the art of the Indigenous people of the art of the American West, not just Remington. And so it's an interesting thing. And I just thought, well, you're so much younger than me, you must have had this stuff when you're.
I didn't have any.
Wow. Okay. Who's ushering? I see you have a couple of questions in the chat there, Nellie.
Yes. So let me pull this up here.
I see Kim's comment. Thank you, Kim.
Yes, I see Kim. Congratulations on a beautiful show. And we have a question here from Lori. Are there any references to the human body or face in your work? Such as an undulating river?
I would say no on faces. I mean, I guess in good weather, honestly, there is like a slight notion of a face. I think with my abstraction, I try really hard to, once I can completely identify something, I've got to alter it so you can't completely place it. Because once you do, I think it gets stuck and I want it to stay really open. So, but if it comes across a little bit, then I can let it be as long as it feels complete. The body, I think it does in this sort of its size, the scale. I mean, some of them are like 8 to 10 feet tall, but I think they feel little bodily and just like their kind of largeness, and like almost like this kind of like closing you in a little bit. But that's about as close as I get to references of the body. So.
Wonderful. Yeah, to expand on that, if you haven't had the chance to go check out Teresa's show in LA and you're in LA, please go and experience it in person, because I think that, as you said about this play of scale, when you go into this space, you really almost have a very, the energy just kind of reverberates off of them. And it's really kind of a similar Rothko-like chapel experience with these works, especially when you get to stand there. And as we said, there's just this energy to them. So please, definitely, if you are in LA, come check out the show. It is spectacular. Yeah. And let's see. Oh, and we have a question here from Bobby. Can you expand upon the use of new petroleum materials in traditional processes?
That's an interesting, good question, Bobby. I know, because Beaumont is a complete oil town, actually, in Texas. So it is funny that I, started using these plastics while I lived there. Use of new petroleum materials. I'm trying to think through that a little bit in traditional processes.
Well, I guess for me, I find myself using contemporary materials a lot, also in a weaving context. And I find like it's easy in traditional art materials like bronze and iron to reference the history of modernism. But you're doing that with in that context, you're doing it with a material and a process. And you've abstracted that with a new material to talk about ancient ways of doing things. And I find that's actually something that the generation is doing.
Yeah.
And I just need help articulating those ideas,
I guess I kind of, sometimes I struggle a little bit with, I don't know if this is totally going to answer your question, but I do struggle with the sort of artificial choice of using the AstroTurf. I know it's not ecologically the best decision, but it's also here, it's existing. And I think that, we're ordering it for baseball fields and football fields and all playgrounds, like whatever it's used for. And so I think my approach, or not even approach, but like my attraction to that is using this material that's already existing and kind of trying to bring a life to it. And there's also this way of like reusing what we have. So I think, yeah.
We have maybe time for one final question, and this comes from Tracy. She was curious if you have any plans for creating other sculptural pieces using reeds or other materials.
I do. I collected a bunch of cattails, actually, from where my parents are in Eastern Montana, and drove them back to LA a few years ago, and they're sitting in my studio. I'm excited. I finally, sometimes I have to sit with materials for a while, but I finally know what I'm going to do with them. So I think they're going to definitely come onto the wall pieces, actually. They do here and there every now and then, but yeah, I'm excited to get into that a little bit more, Tracy. So
wonderful.
Let's see.
Okay, yeah.
And you have a question from your dad you have to answer.
Yeah.
I do. Okay. All right. Let's see. How is your work now changing more towards the traditional? Yeah. Yeah, I think it is moving towards the traditional in a way that it hasn't before. And that's because I'm bringing on these direct materials from my culture. We don't have a photo of a piece called Decorate. It was where I started adding buffalo hide into the work. So I think it's like bringing in the corn husks from the Hidatsa corn that I'm growing, bringing in the buffalo hide, bringing in the willow. These are ways for me to directly reference my tribe and my culture, and do it in an abstract way that's making sense for the larger whole of the piece as well. And it feels to me really grounding, which I think is the most exciting part of bringing that in. Oh yeah, here, thank you, Jacob. This is decorate. Let's see, I'm trying to figure out how to move the chat box, but yeah, so you can see the buffalo hide there used as a form, and then the willow in the bottom left corner can, finishes out the shape there. So, and I love the, like, in person, that texture of like the soft and the astroturf. And actually, while I was at UCross talking about grasses, Scott, I think you brought that up at one point. The astroturf looked so much, I would like stare out the window and it was March and things were not green yet. And it was kind of dry. And there's like this really, a way that the astroturf feels like the grass, it's like that sound, the look, yeah. So, and then I love what the buffalo hide does with its softness. And so.
Well, fantastic. I'm just so thrilled to have both of you in conversation. I feel like we could probably go on forever because it is so rich and deep especially in this exhibition. And I really want to thank everybody who attended too. And I wanted to see too if there's any kind of final thoughts from either of you as we wind down.
I just want to thank you all for joining, and I'm so excited to meet you, Scott. And
No, likewise. I'm thrilled to have this type of opportunity, even across so many miles. That I really look forward to watching your work as it grows and develops. I think it's to me, as someone who teaches Native art, it just really gives me hope. So, thanks. Thank you, Nellie, for having me.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. I just thought about the time too of Hungary.
I'm a night owl.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us, and look forward to perhaps grabbing coffee with both of you soon here in LA.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Be well. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.